Just, you know, well,
No.
it's
fine. We'll sort it.
Again,
By the way, they
originally
call
have to speak like.
Yeah. They call it RPI, revenue protection. That's what it's called on the train. Yes, why do you checking?
Do we know, is that the mic for the room?
RPI, revenue protection.
Sorry.
Yeah.
She used RPI. I'm like, what is it? RPI? So revenue protection.
Oh, I'm gonna say it. Should I read it out?
I call it
Right?
cozy. Yeah.
I'm gonna
Ugh.
No, I'm.
Are you good to go?
Yeah, whenever you
Okay.
Okay, I will. Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's give it a go then. Weird. If you stand like 2 feet
Yeah.
further here, the acoustics are different.
Anyway, these are echoing back to yourself.
Yeah, it is odd. Okay.
Really.
So welcome to the second cover seminar of the new academic year, and we have for the first time a repeat presenter who did an event with us last January, talk about something else. So I'm just going to briefly introduce Adam Jones, who's going to talk about his nice new book on the data economy, cyberpunk, and lots of fun stuff. So with that, I'll hand it over to you to take it away.
No, thank you all for having me. So this is a talk basically about my upcoming book called The New Flesh: Life and Death in the Data Economy, and it's really attempting to address a lot of the things that me and the Asset Horizon Collective, so as your podcast educational center online, deal with, particularly problems around forms of management, control society, and cybernetics. So a lot of this book really is coming out of that last book, as well as some research I've been doing contemporaneously with that, which is on Mark Fisher and the CCRU, the early accelerationist cyber philosophy, particularly works, Sadie Plants, Nick Land, who I believe used to teach here, but is now known for other work. And generally that kind of accelerationist milieu. And the reason why I want to talk about accelerationism and that milieu is because it was an abject failure. It produced a lot of cool t-shirts. You can buy some of them from the Asset Horizon web store, of course, but no, it didn't really work. I mean, the attempt with cybernetic philosophy in the 90s to the early 2000s was to more or less ally with forces of new technological apparatuses in order to essentially push them beyond the boundaries that capital could control them, and in so way lead to a total system meltdown. The aesthetics of these general ideas lended itself to a kind of cyberpunk imaginary, particularly the works of Neuromancer, William Gibson and Blade Runner, as ways of escaping the human. And this wasn't a reactionary anti-humanism. It had a lot of strong sort of roots in, for example, the feminism of Sadie Plant as ways of escaping dominant forms of subjectivation and subject functions, for example, that make social reproduction what it is today. My problem with this, though, was essentially that it ended up believing too much in the hype of the technologies it was investing in. Ultimately, the problem was that the tech wasn't something that was changing us. The internet didn't make us less human. As Mark Fisher then went on to note in Capitalist Realism, it created something that made us even more trapped in our own sort of subjectivity and humanity as it's hitherto been composed. This was Mark Fisher's idea of the e-dipod, taking from Deleuze-Guattari's theory of Oedipalization to build us into standard bourgeois subjects. Now, the main thesis of this book is that it's one that's almost trivial to the extent that we are producing data all of the time. We cannot not produce data, especially in contemporary, particularly contemporary urban environments, because one, more and more people are on social media platforms. Two, more and more spaces are recorded. Three, more and more things are digitized for the sake of platforms. And when we think of platforms today, I follow Tiziana Terranova in saying that the internet is effectively dead. It is the corporate platform complex. There is no longer this idea of the frontier. The internet is not an undiscovered country. It is the first country that is pre-discovered. It is a pure mapping, and it's not an elsewhere so much as it is built on real flesh and blood infrastructure, be that the limbs that dig out the coltan or the server banks and data centers themselves. I recently saw Dan McQuillan describe the cloud. I believe spoke here a couple of weeks ago actually. To talk about the cloud less as a cloud than as a drought. All it does is extract moisture and energy. And like it has a real implication. And so when it comes to data economy and the production of data, and indeed the political economy of data, I wanted to write this book, The New Flesh, to try and explain these the new fusions of humanity and media. Now, this is, the title, of course, draws itself from Videodrome, David Cronenberg, Neuromancer, those similar kinds of cyberpunk imaginaries that happened with the CCRU. But there's a risk here. I mean, I tried to sort of unpack what does it mean to say that we are the new flesh? It doesn't mean that data is this new awesome thing that is like a new appendage to ourselves. That's commodity fetishism, because data is just a commodity. We know this because we don't own our own data. You can leave a digital will these days, but the digital will is more of a plea. You don't own that, so they can do what they want with your data. So I look forward to seeing everyone's holograms, or you seeing mine in God knows how long. But secondly, the new flesh is not it's not only with data, and it's not simply the idea that we become new flesh the more we interact with media, the more that media feeds into us. The more we start speaking in memes and internet slang and the like, because that's just influence. Influence is nothing new. People have always been influenced in their behavior by the media they consume. Rather, what I want to argue is that the new flesh is precisely not so much behaving like the data or the media one consumes, but rather the body that behaves like the data it produces. And I think only in the context of looking at generally the way in which we are constantly producing data for platforms in many ways, in ways that encourage us to produce more, essentially, to give an example of Twitter or YouTube, one is ultimately filling in the gaps between advertisers. One is, sorry, yeah, please.
Can you just make this last again?
So regarding data production in the new flesh, sorry.
Yeah, it's not about the more today.
Yes, sorry. It's not about the new flesh, as I define it, is essentially one's new flesh is the part of oneself that behaves in a way influenced by the data that one produces. The way that data production, the kind of orienting of the self and behavior and the body towards data production impacts how we feel about ourselves. So one of the examples I give this is the second chapter of the book, is called feedback addiction. So feedback addiction, and I'm drawing here on the anti-psychiatrist, psychologist, R.D. Laing. Feedback addiction is, and it's applicable outside of the digital spheres, but it's particularly apt to catch it in digital spheres. It is more or less being addicted to the feedback one gets from likes, comments, from one's interactions online. This can also be found in, for example, the relationship between a writer and a student and a teacher. One gives feedback on essays, and then the student, if they sort of particularly identify or want to produce good work and identify with the goodness of their work, they may indeed try to preempt your feedback by, as a philosopher, this is how we're taught to write. Anyone in humanity is taught to write by preempting arguments, and that you have a kind of internal censor. And feedback addiction, as I sort of tried to describe it, is more or less what shows up on the case when, an account, for example, take an account on social media. There is no content that counts other than the one you put through it. Take a social media account, you have content, you put content onto the account, and it flows away in a matter of seconds, because everyone's doing that. It's a feed, it's a flow. Ultimately, one has to keep putting it out there to get feedback back to oneself. And ultimately, this can lead to a kind of addictive setup when someone's identity becomes totally consumed with the online. To the extent that I use and I'm drawing on personal experience as well as my colleagues in Asset Horizon here, because more or less we're content creators. And if any part of your rent payments become tied to the internet, you are fucked. Because you are entirely tied to the feedback mechanisms of those platforms themselves, which want to incentivize you to keep producing, keep filling the gaps there. And I'll just drag it out for a second, but this book is more or less an exploration of data as an economy and what it's doing to us. But I wouldn't want to restrict it solely to the area of social, because at the end of the day, data production it's quite a minute thing in the grand scheme of things. Data production on social media, because another theory that is put forward towards the book, towards the end of the book, is a theory of what I'm calling a data plantation. This is because the production of data, particularly in forms of so-called micro work. I don't know if people remember there was a 7 years or so, Phil Jones, who's no relation, put out a book called Work About the Worker, about these kinds of micro work. So, for example, you would correct search engine queries. So you'd be sent a version of someone, say they search for, books on Amazon, you'd be sent the results of that query and you would moderate and you would rate how accurate the results were. Okay. And for example, captures as well, identifying if you're human, identifying and labeling components of images. These are the contours of contemporary micro work, and millions of people are currently micro workers being paid pennies per task. And the vast majority of these, as Bill Jones pointed out, are mostly in the global south and mostly in refugee camps. And they're being, and to give an example of a particular micro work program, Appen, one of the biggest micro work platforms, Appen were subcontracted to do work for a project called Maven by Google. Maven is a project from the Pentagon, and it's essentially Appen had people in refugee camps labeling faces of people who look like them, or drone systems that, if they ever decided they wanted to escape from that concentration camp, would hunt them. Data production is essential to the contemporary global economy because it is ultimately the things that allow us to moderate data sets. I mean, this is why New Flesh is fundamentally a book about data production that tries to go beyond, I posted too much and now my brain's weird, and more into the fact that this has permeated more and more of our everyday economy, even from having as innocuous as a Tesco club card. You're being paid for data. It's not a discount. You're being paid for the data you make for that specific area, your specific account, and that helps them gauge stock, demand in various areas. It's a logistical measure. I mean, if we ask for the payments of all the data we made, there wouldn't be much left in the economy, especially somewhere like the United Kingdom, where it seems to run on hope, dreams, and data, and mostly just lies. Speaking of lies, artificial intelligence. But the vast majority of the second half of the book takes its attempt at trying to demystify this concept of artificial intelligence by looking at the idea of data economy. So in particular, I go back to, with the help, of course, of Phil Jones, going back to Jeff Bezos' description of AI as AAI, artificial intelligence. I mean, he called the platform that the big microwork platform that trains their AI Mechanical Turk. He wasn't hiding this, but in the age of OpenAI and Sam Altman, we have been dealt with, and public consciousness about technology has been dealt an increasingly devastating blow with the image of AI. And the image of AI is mostly something that tries to obscure the work thereof. I mean, ChatGPT moderators unionized in Kenya, I believe, was it last year? And generally, the more microwork there is, the more people doing microwork who are forced into it by displacement by ongoing war. And indeed, AI is nothing separate. AI is just a human being. It is just alienated intelligence. It is Marx's fixed capital coming back haunt us. This is relatively standard critique of AI. We've seen it long enough. The only thing I want to add with AI is particularly some of the ways in which we talk about AI and these machines as being machines to steal labor also has certain risks, which is there's a risk in talking about these machines as operating in such ways that we actually do marketing for them. So, for example, the IDF's new AIs, Lavender, Where's Daddy, like one of them they call, which is designed to find Palestinians as soon as they return to their homes and blow up the rest of their families. There's a reason why they're telling us about this tech. It's because it's more of an advertising thing to say it actually does that. You don't need an AI to generate a kill list of people you've already marked out for extermination. It's mostly marketing. And so trying to navigate around the hype of AI really requires a kind of base level materialism. So this has gone for 15 minutes. So just to round up, actually, I shall talk about the biggest chapter of the book, which is the most speculative and the weirdest, and hopefully the most exciting, which is language. Is it a virus? I wanted to essentially draw on. So a lot of this book was based on a talk I gave my friend Billy Cashmore at this place called PAF in northern France. It's this deconsecrated nunnery where a bunch of artists hang out, and it sounds far more, starload than it is, thank God. But it was actually we did a presentation on essentially called transformations, trying to understand control society through transness, and particularly the frontier of fascism is transphobia. And one of the things that this book aims to do is to use cybernetics, to use genuine sort of cybernetic philosophy after the CCIU, to try and understand one of the most potent themes in sort of the cyberpunk imaginary, which is coding and virality. Also to try and give a viral way of resisting these narratives from put out by transphobic fascists. One of which is notoriously that of social contagion. It's, we hear Mr. Musk talking about the so-called woke mind virus. That phrase itself is something of a virus. There's no such actual thing. And in doing so, this concept of virality, what I end up doing in this book is more or less trying to lay out a viral theory of communication by using contemporary virology to detach the notion of virus from disease. So we don't typically have to think about viruses solely in terms of disease anymore. So we used to define a virus by seeing someone presenting a disease, taking a sample, then working back from disease to viral matter, and then positing that as a virus cause a certain symptomology. Sorry, this is what's called Koch's postulates method. And now, however, we understand viruses mostly is made up of writing. We understand viruses mostly in terms of informatics, which is why we can use things like retroviruses for genetic therapies. And using this kind of insight, I wanted to try and basically drive a viral theory of communication. Not in a way that we can, do a kind of marketing, because everyone wants to go viral these days. Everyone wants their thing to go viral. That sort of techniques isn't really possible. It's because virality is fundamentally a logic that goes against control. Virality is inherently mutable. Mutation is the reason why we can't keep up with COVID, for example. It takes a hell of a lot of work to stop virality from itself going viral. And for this, I try to posit two ways of looking at virality and looking at coding. The first way is typically Deleuze-Guattarian, it's major versus minor, it's dominating versus liberating. And for me, it's primarily additive versus subtractive. So a fascist use of virality would be one that tries to virally or make a code go viral that encodes someone else as a certain kind of thing to be destroyed. We can see this with the way in which the press spread. Open up a British newspaper, make sure you're wearing a mask. But and you will see, the copy of the Daily Mail is one of the worst viral producers one can ever see. And it spreads these codes, supplements one's experience of the other, be they a migrant, a trans person, a Palestinian, anyone, with a certain kind of supplement. And there are and the big example I give, other than the press today, is the destruction of the Institute of Sexual Science by the Nazis in the 1930s. Contrasting to that, we have minor virality, which is subtractive virality. Essentially, ones that subtract code so that you can transform oneself from the forms imposed on you by the dominant codes of socialism. For this, I draw on the work of someone, Mel White-Jen, their work on viral archives, basically transition archives of trans men on YouTube, try and articulate essentially viral strategies for escaping various kinds of coding and control society. Essentially, for viruses, what the viral theory in this book would be to give a counter form of communication, whereas in other aspects of the book, sometimes the book more advocates for the destruction of communication wholesale. these machines, they can be broken. I'm something of a Luddite on this matter. You know, a big magnet could probably save a lot of energy wastage from a data center. But on that note, I think I've gone into the rambling phase here. So rather than spew any more semiotic viruses about the book, I'll end it there and say thank you very much for coming.
I'm going to be super rude and call myself first, just to So I want to ask you something about I just learned last week about the idea of what's called Flanderization, like Flanders from The Simpsons, right?
Yeah.
And the idea of Flanderization is that first Flanders is like the sort of good neighbor who's the contrast to Homer. But over the Simpsons, because his weird propensities are more popular, he becomes more and more exaggerated versions of this, right?
Mm.
And this is the same thing that happens with content creators. You basically produce the thing that gets engagement. Or it happens for everyone, where you post the thing every day that gets more likes.
Mm.
So it's that weird intersection of like the technology and how it affects your subjectivity, how it affects how we become, as TV would say, data subjects.
Mhm.
And so what I want to ask is, in the beginning of the book, you talk about how cybernetics needs to look inward to creatively involute.
Mhm.
But what I'm curious about, how do we get a process of creative involuting or breaking inwards when our subjectivity is being shaped by wanting to become more and more exaggerated meme-like versions of ourselves,
Mhm.
which seems to almost like block that turning inward. If that makes sense. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. In terms of where I can only speak for myself in this point. I mean, I've never written a book that, apart from the PhD, which hasn't been a result of something of a mental rift, let's say, in terms of the current control society. Not to say I went, full land here or anything, but just to say that this book was started off to some extent as, me and my friends have been talking to each other through cyberspace, throughout lockdown, coming up to 4 years now. Something's not right here. Why am I so annoyed at these people who live in my phone? Why am I interested in, invested in getting their responses, their feedback, given, it's just flipped on the screen. There was something of a self-interrogation there. And I think to some extent you do just hit a wall of kind of misery. I mean, Mark Fisher, paradigm example of this in terms of when he left Twitter and he sort of wrote about his own addiction to the internet, very much an influence on this part of the book. And eventually my experience was, well, something is wrong with this. And then when you fall down the rabbit hole a bit more, you understand that the data subject, the data, I mean, that's a fantastic term. There is something to be derived here in terms of the misery that it presents, because so feedback addiction, I think, follows a model of what Lang identified as ontological implosion. So there's a group therapy session that Lang is conducting, and one of the people arguing, the two of them are having an argument, and one of them says to the other, "Stop, just stop, please." And then the other one says, "Well, why? We're just having, a friendly debate. Can't you handle, free speech?" And then the other one says, "Well, if you win this argument, you win an argument. If I lose this argument, I cease to exist." There is something existential to the extent that people identify with the particular configuration of their online existence. And this is at the very least fascinating to the extent that it can happen to anyone. I mean, why the fuck does Elon Musk care what anyone thinks? Why does Mark Andreessen want us to like him? Why does Trump want our rulers all want to be liked? Very much, because they are fully digital subjects. Could they break out of that? Break out of that requires honestly something of a break with the positive flow of content, because otherwise there's no reason to stop consuming.
Are they caught in a Hegelian master-slave dialectic?
I
do argue that in the book, yes.
I'm gonna go over here and see everyone, and then
So, no, I mean, this is a really great talk, and I can't wait to read your book. I had a couple points that I wanted to just ask on this, because I'm largely in agreement with the critique, which I think is pretty unassailable. But for me, I guess there's two aspects of this that are worth thinking. The first is, are we, in doing this and talking about this kind of like subjectivization and corporalization of data and how we become datafied subjects, right?
Mhm.
Are we in many ways confusing the actual cause with the symptom? So in this sense, right,
Mhm.
what we're really talking about is extractive economies that
Mhm.
are relatively new historically, but
Mhm.
nothing relatively new to those who
Mhm.
study capitalism.
Mhm.
So when we then begin to talk about AI and data in these types of aspects, I think one thing that we happen to do sometimes is that we ignore all the ways in which things that may annoy us or whatever. Actually, like a lot of people get a lot of convenience out of it.
Yeah.
They like this, they enjoy it. And I'm not saying this to take away from the critique, but then to say, well, what would then a post-capitalist form of AI and data look like? What would be the labor regimes around that? What would be the sustainable
Mhm.
networks around that? What's actually required?
Mhm.
Because I think what I'm broadly worried about with the Luddite type of perspective is that we kind of forget that part of the point about accelerations to a certain extent is that it were the first time since the futurist and modernist kind of revolutionary movements of the 20s and 30s captured a sense that the left was excited about new forms of agency.
Yeah.
So I think that would be something that I would just want to think, because I agree with the critique, but I think you're really critiquing capitalism. You're not actually necessarily critiquing data itself, which can be extraordinarily interesting and exciting and the new forms of agency. And I think we have different people working on different things here, but the other point I want to ask about that, and it's kind of goes to your last point, if Stephen talked about the plenarization, I actually think there's a kind of wrestleification, which is more about like,
Kicking?
huh? Well,
Kicking?
no, more about like, there's this kind of famous thing about Vince McMahon who does WWF, and this is the last time I'll mention WWF, though it's something I will still watch, unfortunately, because I'm a very serious person. But the whole point was that you had this actual evil corporate owner who was part of an actual evil exploitative industry. And what he ended up doing was making himself an evil character so people could get involved in the drama of this. And one of the things that you're talking about is the fact that what we're now doing is saying, okay, here's our society a spectacle, right? Like Donald Trump, why he's so interesting is that he actually serves as the Russification, right? Because for liberals, he's kind of like, I don't have to actually get involved in the actual structural problems of capitalism. I can just hate Donald Trump. And for those who are supportive of Trump, it's like, oh, well, I don't have to actually engage with what a populist real movement against the status quo can be. I can just support Trump. It's the same kind of voyeuristic but interactive way in which we engage with them. So I'm kind of wondering, like, when we're starting to talk about these types of things, how we actually avoid going with our critique into the Kane kind of Russification or kind of society of spectacle, which these things actually fundamentally rely on, and of which their perpetuation is dependent on.
Yeah, so just the first thing regarding sort of, this isn't really a new economy, it's just capitalism. Absolutely. Yeah. My big critique of AI is AI does not name a new social relation, it only includes the currently presently existing one. It's proletarianization all the way down. It's one of the few frontiers that we haven't founded. I mean, in terms of the excitement about new forms of agency, this is something I tried to deal with in first chapter somewhat regarding. So why isn't cyberspace the absolute Hegelian paradise? It should be, shouldn't it? Because Hegel's whole idea is we create a second nature through the social, and then by mediating our particular interests through this grand sphere of social mediation, we will sort of unite our particular interests with the universal, and that final contradiction has been sublated, and we can all be, fine and lovely. And it's absolute spirit. It's second nature par excellence. So what's my problem with it? We can finally partake in this by posting through social spheres, by data production. We can finally partake in that feedback loop by which we can self-determine the medium of our own mediation. Why haven't we that? Absolute spirit, done and dusted, fine. History's over in that sense. And there's there are Hegelian critiques. That's how we get there. So Tom McGowan, we're too particular. He's a pure universalist. And I say, well, yeah, there's particular problems here, but it's in whose particular interest the tech is run for. When it comes to certain Luddism, I mean, I I can't help but think of, there's a line from Tony Negri and Felix Guattari's Communists Like Us, which is, who wants all this shit,
Well, but this is just very quickly the interesting thing that people, and I think you're wonderful to put out this point about the Tesco card.
Yeah.
Let's follow this further, right? And I think, in one of Phoebe's past books, she kind of didn't almost touch on this, which is that it has a strategic purpose, but then after a while, what becomes really interesting is like they don't know what the I'm gonna use profanity sometimes. Literally, they don't know what the fuck to do with all this stuff. Tesco has so much data, it has no idea what to do. It doesn't even know if it's strategic anymore. So it's not just a kind of graver bullshit job. They're literally making up datafied subjects to deal with data that's collected that they don't even know what's the point. And it's like that's the real addiction, right? It's the complex, it's the obsessive thing that ever more data, but nobody knows what it's for. No, I mean, when they did the first mass surveillance stuff at the NSA, right? The thing that they discovered was most Americans aren't terrorists, but they occasionally look at porn at work. Right? Like that was the big insight, right? Which is fair enough. But I think that's also interesting when she says, like, who needs this? And this is the point, is that capitalism has a declining rate of profit, but also one in which it creates its own industries around things that it's not even sure if it needs. It just keeps going. Sorry. It's 2 cups of coffee.
It's okay.
Oh,
go
sorry.
Yeah, so I still. Well, your reaction to Peter's own data agency. So you really don't believe that's.
I think there is potential. There's a kind of hope there that data can be a kind of agency insofar as I think there can be agency to data production. I mean, it's towards the end of the book talking about this concept of the viral archive, essentially an archive that presents possibilities of transformation rather than just abstract and sort of ossified forms that are catalogued and cut off from any kind of new becoming. I leave the book profoundly ambiguous because one of the real, there's the new flesh isn't the first image of this, and I say this in the book. It's by far not the first. The first image is Donna Haraway's cyborg. This idea of new forms of pleasure. It's a politics of pleasure, and she's not being, she's not a simple techno optimist or techno naivety to what Haraway is doing. And I sort of say that the new flesh is just a concept that tries to look at it from the point of proletarianization, and I leave open the possibilities for kind of cyber revolution. I just don't know if the platform economy is going to let that make that be any kind of possibility.
Maybe I'll throw in there a question from online.
Wait, can we do?
Sorry.
No, I could quickly go just because I really want to help with also talk about agency just very quickly, because this whole I think I can't wait to read it and have a discussion with you. Existential orientation with internet recognition. So, and how to make a materialist argument. And I actually so this is the critique. We're not behaving to become data, but behaving based on data. It was so cool when you said, wait, hang on, because I was kind of like, so that shift in terms of behavioral, and then it makes me think about the agency question, but to do with recognition. And I think so that brings me back to kind of thinking about recognition versus redistribution, this kind of question of Fraser and Honneth. And obviously her being on the redistribution side and the recognition being Honneth. And this has a subjectivity point because I'm trying to bring some of those kinds of arguments into the question around datafication and subjectification, and also the real narrowing down and the limitations around what point and who decides in terms of self-production. And then one thing I'm trying to talk about also is the access question, which links with agency. So the assumption that there is the liberal subject, the data subject, actually this comes out of data law. So I'm looking at it legally from the problems and protections for working data subjects thing, and then data production and social relations and data production. And so when thinking about those types of things, I think it really will start to matter even more and more, because you have consumers, workers, citizens, protected characteristics, all these things that are linked with data, but the narrowing of that moment, which is very important, that ontological point of the right to the kind of production, the self-production sort of thing, where this is exactly the point around, and I love the way you said it. So like not behaving to become data, but behaving based on data that's already been produced. So that recursive feedback loop becomes highly restrictive, quite prison-like in a sense, around categorization of the self, and that is hugely problematic and really matters. So I don't think you need to like think of this as a question because it's such a big problem, but recognition versus redistribution, because then how to bring a materialist argument when the minute you talk about data as a product, as though just because you own it means you can do something within it, still collapses back into that point of that. So the one who has access to agency based on owning your own data already may or may not have limited access. So that's access to what I talk about inequality, access to inequality which already exists in terms of that. So there's no way of kind of, I guess, managing that whole problem right now, but I think it does come back to, and that's why I'm going back to these kind of very important texts with that kind of stuff, and especially when we talk about recognition, because in terms of social relationality and building a better future,
I mean, regarding the question of recognition, I feel like I do think that the go to classic for idealism, classically I do to some extent cyberspace is an attempt to do a kind of literal idealism because you can at least program it, it's a pre-discovered country, it's a pure territory of pure mapping, but at the very least, the massa part of it is stuff that's very low up, if needs be. But in terms of recognition, I mean, I think the structure of the account, really does split us into the account functions similar to apperception, and you're in a similar situation as the apologies for Hegel, the beginning of the master-servant dialectic, which is you believe that every object is only an object insofar as it is an object for a subject. And so the subject keeps going and says, well, that thing's dependent on me. I negate it because it's really just me anyway. And we do that with posting to some extent because the account has no content other than that was put through the account, and yet the content is always flowing. So there's no fixed points really, which is why we require the recognition of others. But that is just another data packet. That's just another notification. And so I think the split in the sort of the subjectivity that is reconfigured in the split between the accounts and the identity. This is also part of my critique of Jonah Peretti, his early text on BuzzFeed. There's a recognition here in terms of just the data we're recognized as now. I think it needs the destruction of the platform, just to sort of, or at least what Doctor is talking about interoperability. You can't take your friends and your connections with you to other platforms. The thing is, if you've gotten to the point you can force interoperability on the platforms, why do you destroy them? Because at that point you've already got them by everything you could have them for anyway. At that point, you're no longer asking permission.
I have another question as well, but if you want to go.
So, what Sadie asked online, should I not use stable diffusion like a scrying mirror? Does a materialist demystification? Oh, you can read it. Sorry. Does a materialist demystification of machine learning processes foreclose this kind of transcendental approach? Not trying to be the same tech pro AI mystification.
I don't necessarily see why not, insofar as you can see as you are scraping anything anyone's going to put out in individual context to try and see what comes out. But in terms of the magic there, if we're going to think about it in these occult terms, let's go with Deleuze and Guattari. Deleuze and Guattari and the CCIU love this theory of demonology. A demon is just this, something you can ally with in exchange for you becoming its reproductive organs. So a demon will reproduce its own being through you, and in exchange for that, you gain a certain power of becoming. But these demonic bargains are demonic for a reason. They're Faustian. My critique of CCRU, and this is actually from a different upcoming book, so I did an introduction to Mark Fisher's PhD thesis, is basically they do kind of enclose you. I mean, it depends what deal you're making, and of course, there's always an argument as well to yes, it's incredibly wasteful, but who decides what waste is worth it? I still think those wastes aren't worth it, but Maya Chronic a while ago, they wrote a paper on the urbanomic NFT project, and so the NFT question, which I'm not a fan of, but the paper's good, reapplies the battalion question of what waste is worth wasting, and so that's I think a political rather than an arcane matter at this point. I'm not sure.
Okay, right, my question is, from an ethical perspective, I mean, you're talking about, we've just talked.
Mhm.
And since we're living in the data economy, so you have, consumers of data, producers of data.
Mhm.
Then you have different third-party consumers as well, data sets, so it's a big value chain. You're using the data from one end of the spectrum to the other, whether they're generating passing it on to someone. So my question is, what are the systems of accountability then? Who is accountable for data? Because anything can go wrong within any point within that chain. So who would be held accountable?
People that end up being held accountable for the data are probably the micro workers who are paid like 10 pence to go to moderators. So in terms of moderation of data, that is kind of left in terms. Do you mean accountability in the sense of like to make sure fit data is sort of accurate and also doesn't go wrong? Or?
Obviously, there's some. If it's being used, then it could be used for good purposes, bad purposes. Right? So, in case where data is being misused, then who would be accountable? I mean, where would you trace that chain, or where would you go back to the origin, to the producer, or I mean, are there any systems where you would know?
You could
Within the
start
chain,
going to
yes,
EU
exactly,
meetings,
structure.
start going to EU meetings on this. Seriously.
Yeah, GDPR notwithstanding.
Oh, yeah.
In terms of legal and moral accountability, it probably would be the people on this. It probably would be people on this platform who run the tech bros, basically. But
there's so much psychosocial violence happening in this space. Can I just quickly
please,
support what you're saying? Because, like, for example, facial recognition that's being kind of willy-nilly the police in this country. And I'm sorry, but what about the right to be to not be recognized, or to be the right to not be misrecognized? This is the thing. I mean, who's accountable? I mean, these stories where it's for shoplifting purposes. You walk into Boots on the high street, you're like, friendly, as long as you're not a shoplifter, it's okay that we suddenly have your face and we're gonna cross-check that the minute you put your credit card because it's contact sort of thing, contactless.
But I think that the danger to go on the work that Atika does.
Sorry?
That's because
So
we're
Atika
works
works on, she works in part, if I can be, on the use of different digitalized systems for forms of both gender discipline and empowerment.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Now, the question that I think that's really interesting is that, yes, Phoebe, you're absolutely right. There's the Orwellian kind of modernist thing about facial recognition and traditional authoritarians. What happens when you have a situation like and you are using this? Who's accountable for if this data is actually making good decisions, if this data is actually feeding into a algorithm? And these are very serious things because, in a sense,
And the
right,
person who's
you can even have something that's quite empowering, but these can be used as disciplinary mechanisms for saying, well, actually, like, you shouldn't be budgeting in this way because it may work for you, but it may not work collectively for your demographic. So I think these are also things that are much more neoliberal and much less obvious in terms of the psychosocial violence. And I think the kind of granular
I think it's pretty
work
obvious
that you do.
actually, when you look at what's happening with people when they're taken down to the police station because they were misrecognized. That's really happening.
No, absolutely.
That's
So I
also
think
psychosocial violence. That's
so I think we have to capture both levels. Of
absolutely right. Yeah.
But just Peter said was right. So genes are making. So where is that? So we're looking at different interfaces. Interoperability here. Where can we draw the line between so this decision, or this was a decision made by the machine using a particular kind of data which was produced by humans. So are humans accountable? Are people who are designing those algorithms, or are the consumers, where that data is shared and passed on to third-party organizations? So where does accountability stand, in this?
No, yes. So in particular regarding these things all require government sign-off. Part of me wants to say the government departments themselves, but again, as we were talking about, these machines are designed precisely to avoid accountability. It's an example of the IDF kill list machines. And then we can think, is it the person who programs them? But who's accountable for the institutionalist whoever is accountable for the institutional epistemology of our governing machines, they are accountable. And they probably don't know what the word institutional epistemology means either. So there's maybe we might have to go beyond a punitive framework here. But in terms of, I got to say,
Adam, there are compliance questions that have different.
If I could jump in here, I think part of the difficulty is that, quoting Dan McQuillan here a few weeks ago, if you're taking a more abolitionist perspective on AI, trying to assign particular chain of accountability, kind of besides the point.
Yeah.
I mean, I can understand why it's a good idea, but it's kind of like outside of the question being asked. I
I
think.
mean, well, there is a book that is better on this question than myself that came out recently, which I've been meaning to read. It's literally called The Unaccountability Machine, about government departments to try to. So I'd be more interested in the manufacturing of accountability. I'm just a pessimist. I'm an institutional pessimist about whether we can hold our institutions accountable because.
The question on there about question and another, but I would just say on the podium point that I think is important, which is yes, there's a normativity, whether or not you think that is necessary. But I mean, when you're doing a productive power of accountability, facial recognition or discipline, right? This not only creates different forms of oppression, but also different forms of opportunities for resistance, agency, power. And I think these kinds of analysis are important because they're happening.
Well, this is a debate that really. It reminds me of a debate that sort of came out on the onset of the pandemic. So Ben Bratton in his book, The Revenge of the Reals, talked about the right to be recognised and the right to be recorded. But I think this really does depend on one's optimism or pessimism regarding, the purpose of the system being what it does, written as a genocide machine, and therefore the rash, it seems to only go one way. And I don't. It depends on one's level of institutional stability. I'm not totally anti-cybernetics as some of my comrades may be. I'm not going to get a full of Gambit anytime soon. But in terms of the rights or more right to be recognised by these institutions, I don't trust them. I don't trust them to implement any of these. It depends on the matter of whether one thinks the current institutional setup is something we can trust in the slightest. They seem, I think, the general spectre of democratic accountability, which persisted from sort of the post-war consensus onwards, is gone. The Soviets are no longer pointing nuclear warheads at our ruling class, and they therefore feel no obligation to give us anything anymore. To this extent, if anyone would like to bring back the Soviet Union, it wouldn't be a good idea, but it might at least get us a better NHS or something. But in the absence of the return of the Soviet Union and social democracy as a counterinsurgency measure, I think at this point we just have to find ways to short circuit these systems. And then when they're destroyed, the diagrams are fundamentally going to be the same, but I think it requires a limiting of. I'm sort of a weird Kantian about this. We have to sort of limit knowledge as we understand it in this sort of data-ified, cybernetic, and institutional context in order to make room for politics. Because sometimes the very introduction of the machine is a counter-accountability measure. You can't just, once you build it, well, the machine just needs more data, and we can't decide whether or not we should just, throw the fucking thing out on it. It seems to be the general tendency of the platform economy today. I mean, how many times have the Brits or the US invented new government departments, and then suddenly it became completely ineradicable? Immigration and Customs Enforcement, Department of Homeland Security. These suddenly became timeless, eternal structures as soon as they were posited. Whereas really, you don't have to debate these things; you just have to defeat them.
Yeah, so Adam, just about AI, can you talk a bit more about your views? So Danny McKillen is very direct about his views. He doesn't think there is a way that we can save AI from both in terms of the social and environmental aspects. And we've been recently involved in a research trying to understand whether AI can be harnessed for social good. And there's still there are views coming from both sides and lots of confusion. and I feel like as a researcher, you're kind of building the narrative as well. So I don't want to endorse the narrative that is perhaps less advised and more just following the trend, really. So I wanted to hear, trying to get more insights from Dan and from your views as well, because it's not an area that I am very
No, yeah, Dan's book is also very good. I read it is a cracking book. Dan's book. We did an episode of him a while back, which I did shout out to Stephen because we did end up talking about Clapton FC for a bit. But in terms of where AI is going, can it be used for good? I mean, in terms of like medical edge cases and stuff like that, I don't see a problem. But my main problem is conceptual. In terms of, I don't think it's a good term to be used. I think it's more of an image than it is an accurate descriptor. Part of this is because I don't think intelligence is necessarily a very good category. I'll say one thing actually about intelligence. One, it's very weird that it's quite a big question, and that's kind of me just flattening it and saying, why weren't the philosophers asked on this matter? But I do think we do learn something interesting about how we typically think about intelligence through considering LLMs and AIs. Because when they go wrong, when they produce like shrimp Jesus or whatever, they are constantly described as being hallucinations, or they call it Jason Sadowski calls it Habsburg AI that basically is fed on other AIs, which is now inevitable, causing a kind of bovine spongiform encephalopathy for machines. And I think there's something interesting we can learn about this here, not in terms of nature, in terms of what the AIs, what their intelligence is like, but rather what we mean when we talk about hallucination, dementia, disability, essentially cognitive disability. Now, what I mean by this, and I have to be very careful here, is that the fact that these machines have disabilities before they have, before they have consciousness, experience, or being, tells us more about the nature of disability as a social apparatus than it does about AI. Because these things suddenly become disabled before becoming anything else, because they aren't productive in the ways that we have demanded them to be so, giving them a functional agency through grammar there. And I think AI can tell us a lot about disability, mostly because how the categories are formed primarily due to productive capacity, because these things become disabled before we've given them any other quality, purely on the basis that they're considered only in terms of their productive capacity. But in terms of AI for good, I mean, it'd be tried to say, we just needed workers' control over AI. But what if the workers decide we want to get rid of them? I mean, that would the workers doing data moderation, would they necessarily think, I want to have a unionized version of this job that still pays me nothing? In terms of what Dan, the distinction between good old-fashioned AI, as he calls it, and generative AI, which is the stuff we're really talking about. I mean, it's fun, I've generated Peter Griffin as John Baudrillard a couple of times, great for memes, people love that sort of stuff on the data economy, but it's, I don't think we can use that sort of thing for anything unless we found some sort of way to offset the energy costs, which I don't know if we're going to, because I feel like no one's going to say no to technology companies anytime soon. I mean, so Microsoft recently bought Reactor One on 3 Mile Island to power a data center. At this point, we do have to kind of say no to them, but at this point, it feels like it's in a positive feedback loop of total impunity. I am open to the discussion. I just so far think that AI as a term is the wrong way to frame the conversation. If you're talking about digital labor. Sorry.
No, I'm actually going to say something which might, I don't actually see behind me if somebody's raising their hand. No. Okay, affective computing is one of the disciplines that actually started at the same time as originally, like 1956. And now they're running still with MIT labs. And she's Rosalind Picard. And actually she's doing AI, really interesting stuff with that affective computing arena, which is really effective with disability research. And of course, my critique is that this kind of computing and these technologies are entering working environments. They have put it in the forbidden risk category in the AI Act, which they're quite happy about across the EU, but in the UK, we don't necessarily have that supposed protection. But yeah, in terms of that, there are examples. And then the other thing, just quickly to say around, they didn't ask the philosophers. Well, actually, so Hubert Dreyfus, as I'm sure you know,
Yeah.
did actually do that very early on and said and critiqued and said this is Descartesian dualism. And the reliance on intelligence, so to speak, is that. And people this kind of got out of fashion to talk about AI as though it is actually to do with human intelligence now. So that's problematic maybe in itself. And then, but
Yeah.
somebody's asking a flesh question here, which I'm
Yeah.
fascinated with, because that also links with your usage of flesh. Does that mean that you're Descartesian as well, or are you using that more in a monist? Since we have 5 minutes left, no, I'm just kidding.
Yes. So new flesh, very quickly. Cronenberg's movies are very good. One. Two, I think it's a great term to fuse man and media, well, humanity and media. The concept of flesh, particularly new flesh. Part of the reason I also use flesh, beyond the fact that it sounds good, which is, the downfall of every accelerationist and cybernetic philosopher, is Merleau-Ponty, his work on flesh, and particularly some of the stuff I derived from my old teacher Catherine Malibu and her ideas about body schema. Well, she derives from Ponty.
Yeah.
So just very quickly, Merleau-Ponty, sorry. Very quickly, so one of the things I talk about in the early part of the book is the way in which it changes our relationship to the body. I can put this phone here, I will still feel it go off even if there's no notification. This was first detected in people in ERs, their pages going off, they didn't feel it, there have been studies on this. And so insofar as the integration of communications technology can change the body schema, the map that the brain has of the body, I think is interesting to highlight and interesting to point out in terms of the ways in which they can actually change our relationship to our bodies. Another example of this is where the map of the brain has of the body and the body counteract. So has anyone read Neuromancer? What drugs are the most common drugs in Neuromancer? Speed. What drugs did Nick Land take too much of? Speed. What the drugs to see? It was all speed. You know what you can't take in VR headsets? Speed. You throw up. VR. So the cyber sickness, as we call it, is a conflict. It's basically a conflicting mapping between the map of the virtual environment you're going into and the brain's body schema. That's why you feel queasy. It's why a lot of places recommend you get stoned before you go into VR. Yeah.
Also, you're talking about the nerve system. This is the only bit you missed on the cybernetic nerve system.
I try to avoid that because
Why?
I think the cybernetic attempt to reduce so this is goes everywhere from Vina to people like both Tony and George. The brain is a nervous system, we can map out the nervous system and therefore we can totally integrate humanity into cybernetic machines and increasingly digital machines. My critique of that is the brain does not have an immediate relationship to the body as a component amongst others. It has a mapped relationship, and actually the interaction with cyberspace is the interaction between two maps, not between or indeed two mapped territory systems. So that's my critique of I don't want to purely reduce everything to the nervous system. I think that's more of you cut yourself off from what goes wrong in that aspect and just say it needs more data. So that was it.
Cool. Well, we've done our hour, so maybe we'll leave it off from there and continue chatting if people want. And so we take Adam.
Looking forward to reading.
Thank you for coming. You both necessarize a massive.